to reveal Himself to you in a unique way. And so as I was kind of just chatting beforehand with the Lord, I speak about the whole subject of desire came up, and desire is something that we are all familiar with, and it's a theme that is often, maybe particularly within religious communities, is demonized. I know definitely the way in which I grew up, if you liked something, it was probably wrong. If you desired it, it was definitely sin. You know? And if you enjoyed it, it was undoubtedly of the devil. I don't know if you're familiar with that kind of upbringing. Yes, you are. So I want to look at this amazing theme of desire. Both maybe the negative a little bit, but also the positive. There's something very beautiful about desire. Jesus speaks in John 15 about abiding in Him, and you will desire. So there are desires that awaken in a very beautiful and powerful way. And I'll combine this, this idea about desire with maybe a story that you are very familiar with. And that's the story of Eden, and the story of Adam and Eve. Anyone heard that story before? And what I want to do tonight is give you an alternative way of understanding that story. And you can take it or leave it. You can just, look at it as an interesting, different perspective. I so love the fact that these stories have got multiple layers of meaning. It's not just a right or a wrong way of reading many of these stories, but it's a beautifully three-dimensional story. And if you start looking into the history behind how the stories were written, you suddenly discover that the earliest thinking around it was beautifully diverse. And I'm going to draw from some of those early interpretations from the early church fathers, etc., which ironically is very foreign to much of what we've been taught. Definitely, I've been taught in my religious upbringing. So, desire. Can you remember your first desire? It's interesting that when we think of desire, we often think of something that is generated deep within ourselves, as something that has its origin within ourselves. But maybe desire is not something that originates in you. Maybe desire is not something that is generated in you, but something that is suggested to you, and something that forms you. So let's make it more practical. There was a time in your early childhood development where you had no consciousness of self. I told the story last night how we were walking on the beach, and we walked into these three little toddlers, naked and in absolute bliss, shrieking with joy as they were running into the water and out, and no self-consciousness, just this beautiful, naive innocence. And so there was a time in all of our lives that you weren't conscious of yourself. And it would be difficult to remember it. because mostly the self that remembers is the self that did not exist okay, in that stage. But children develops a sense of an individual self. So before that time of self-consciousness, the child, and they've done various psychological tests, but the child basically perceives him or herself as part of everything that they can observe or feel. There's no separation. What happens to me happens to everything, and what happens there happens to me. It's all one. And if I hear another child cry, I cry with, because I must be hurting. I can hear myself cry. There's this sense of unity with everything that's happening. And so one of the first things that happens for an individual self to come into existence is there needs to be a sense of separation. A sense that I am not everything and everything is not me. In fact, there is no concept of me or self without a sense of separation. That is kind of the earliest ways in which identity is formed, is I am who I am because I'm not you. I am what I am because I'm not this table. And so that sense of separation that occurs in a specific environment, and one of the most significant aspects that can generate a sense of separation or distance is the movement of desire. Because if you are one and whole with everything, you do not desire anything, because it's all you. There needs to be a sense of distance and separation, maybe even a sense of lack, for desire to be awakened of, I want that. And the theorist Rabe and many of the psychologists that took some of his writings and developed it further started exploring this fact that maybe it is not yourself that generates your desires, but rather it is desire that generates yourself. Let me put that another way.
Okay.
If you walk into a room full of, well, let's say there's a room full of toys, and there's a 2-year-old sitting in between the toys, and there's another 2.5-year-old walking in. It's at 2.5, round about the toddler age. The second toddler that walks in, the first thing he will notice is the other toddler. Not the toys and all of those things. The first thing he'll notice is the other toddler. The second thing he will notice is the toy closest to the other toddler. And he'll head for that toy. And suddenly the first toddler will discover that's the toy I've always wanted. and war breaks out.
That's true.
Desire is mimetic and mediated. What I mean by that is I do not just develop a desire for something. Let's take that toy. Let's say that elephant is the toy. Rather, what happens is I look at another being like myself, and I perceive what they desire. That's what's happening in that situation. The one toddler sees the other toddler, sees the toy closest to the other, and the perception is created that that is the toy that's most desirable. And that's why I want it. Now, at the early age, we don't know how to hide it. We kind of develop that skill throughout life, but maybe You'll remember if you had older siblings, the 2.5 or 3-year-old will walk behind the 5 or 6-year-old and just do whatever they do. And whatever they want, I want. And what they eat, I want to eat. You know, they are learning by imitation. That is one of the unique qualities that makes you human, is your highly developed skill to imitate. And we don't like the word imitate, hey, because in today's culture you want to be uniquely and truly yourself. And in that idea that I'm uniquely and truly myself, there's this underlying assumption that I need no one and nothing else to be myself. I can just draw upon this authentic self that's deeply inside of me and be myself. But the truth is, you would not even be able to speak if you could not imitate. The fact that you are all sitting here dressed tonight is because of all of you learned how to dress yourself. And you learned how to dress yourself through a process of imitation. It's just absolutely a part of human existence, is your ability to imitate. Now I'll maybe later on get to the fact that of course there's a way of you being uniquely you and authentically you, but the one thing I want to establish just at the beginning is what makes you uniquely a human being is that you are a being in relationship. That you have not created yourself in isolation, but it's the relationships we find ourselves in that have created us. So that's a bit of a background. Now I want to go to Genesis 2 and to retell that story. One of the most original and authentic ways in which that story of Eden was understood was that it was a story that explored what it means to be human. How do we become human? Now that's a bit different from how I was taught to understand that story. I was taught that this is the story of how Adam and Eve messed it all up for all of us. So it was the story of the fall. It was the story of how disobedience have caused all the crap that we see in the world. It started there. That's an interpretation you're familiar with? Mm-hmm. Okay. So when we approach the text with that question of where did it all go wrong, then that's the answers that's going to be produced. Because you're going to look for those answers. But that's not the question that was originally motivating this narrative to be created. The question that originally pushed this narrative and developed this narrative was, what does it mean to be human? What is our relationship with one another and with God? And in the ancient Jewish way of interpreting that text, they had no concept whatsoever of a fall. In fact, the word fall does not occur in chapter 2 or 3. That should be a clue. This is not a story about the fall. This is a story of what it means to become human. Now, why is that important? Because the way in which we give our own individual stories greater meaning is we put them in the context of a bigger story. And this bigger story, this bigger narrative, if we understand it as there once was a perfect world, a perfect paradise, and there once were perfect people, but boy did they mess up, and that is the reason for everything that went wrong. You see, that kind of interpretation of where your story began immediately communicates a sense of inadequacy. You are not quite what God originally had in mind. And this world isn't quite the world that we had in mind. Isn't that the message of the fall? Is we are fallen. This world is fallen. And that gives us a beautiful narrative to explain why things go wrong. It's not us. It's somebody else a long time ago that messed it up and set us up for this difficult journey we are. So, would you be interested in hearing an alternative way of reading this? Because it could be quite radical, because if you understand your beginning differently, you might understand your own story differently. And if you can interpret your own story differently, if you did not begin in lack, if there wasn't ever a perfect deathless paradise, but rather it speaks of something else, would that have huge implications for how you understand who you are and your relationship with God? And that brings us to this ancient understanding and interpretation of Genesis 2 and 3. Now, why do I start in Genesis 2 and 3? And not in Genesis 1, because Genesis 1 was written much later. If you go and look at the people who study the script, they understand that there are different sources from which the scriptures came. And one of the two big indicators is the fact that in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, almost every story is repeated twice. And what we don't see in our English text is in one story God is referred to as Elohim, and in the other story God is referred to as Jehovah or Yahweh. Until, for the one that refers to God as Elohim, they refer to him as Elohim until he reveals himself to Moses as being Yahweh. Then the name changes to be Yahweh Elohim or Elohim Yahweh. And we've translated it Lord God in our Bibles. But before then, all the stories are these 2 creation stories. Genesis 1 refers to God as Elohim. Genesis 2 and 3 onwards refer to God as Yahweh. They knew God by different names, and they trace it back to 2 kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel and the kingdom of Judah. 2 different kingdoms, 2 different traditions that had similar stories, but still very diverse. So Genesis 2 verse 4 onwards is much older than Genesis 1. So here we deal with a creation story in its own right. When God begins creating. And typical to many of the other creation stories in that time and in that culture, God desires a resting place. And very often that resting place looks like a garden. This is where this garden is not created for humanity. This garden is God's resting place. This is where he's at home. The tree of life, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, all those trees are not created for humanity. They're there for God's enjoyment. Now, even that kind of clears up a lot of questions. Because the way I read it is, okay, God's getting ready. It's all about creating humanity. And he's putting the tree of life there. That's a good option. But he's also putting the tree of the knowledge of good and evil there. And if your question is what went wrong, we think, why the heck put that tree in the middle of the garden? I mean, this is going to cause things to go wrong. Why make the fruit appealing? I mean, if the tree must be there, hide it as far as you can on top of a mountain. Make the fruit ugly. Keep them happy. But in the ancient narratives, the garden was always the place where God rests, where God enjoys the fruit of the trees and everything. And mankind is created to help work the garden. You know, whether you like that narrative or not, it's just kind of the history of where those narratives, there are multiple similar narratives. That was only discovered in 1849 when they again excavated the city of Nineveh in Iraq. And they found about 20,000 clay tablets. And on there they found, for instance, the myth of Adipa, which is just the Akkadian word for Adam. And Adam is not a name, it means the human or the earthly. And you would never say the Adam or the John or the Peter. But throughout this text it refers to the earthly, the Adam. So Adam wasn't a name, it's just a description for earthly. So in this place, God creates the earthly. And one of the things that's interesting is the whole act of creation doesn't happen just instantaneously. God discovers that there's something not good about the situation, that the earthling is alone. And that's not good. And so he makes a plan. He creates animals and he brings the animals. Now even this is interesting because in the first Genesis account, everything is perfectly ordered and humanity is created last. In the second account, man is created and placed into Eden. And even that is a beautiful text because Rashi, one of the Jewish sages that interprets this, where it says God took Adam and placed him in the garden. He said, how does God take us? How does he capture us? And he researches the word and he says that the best way to translate that word is actually God seduced man into the garden, because he does not enforce his will. He entices man and seduces him into the garden. And if you go and look, can you see the theme of desire? It's already starting in the story. And if you go look at the historic context for much of that area, there were some tribes living in the mountains, etc. And there had to be a kind of appeal for why is it better for you to come and live in a garden where you've got to do irrigation, where you've got to work harder. And anthropologists are still scratching their heads as to why we went from hunter-gatherer communities to agricultural communities, because there weren't many benefits. People actually lived better as hunter-gatherer communities. You know, they didn't have as much sickness, they didn't have as much death. Suddenly when you're in a community, sickness spreads. You know, a whole town can be wiped out. It's much more labor intensive. So why go from hunter-gatherer to this agricultural community? So that's just interesting facts, you know, behind the people who research this thing. Says, how was man seduced to come and irrigate the garden rather than just run around and shoot what they want to eat? Yeah. How did we go from carnivores to vegetarians? Any case, so there's this beautiful theme of God seduces the earthling to come and work within this garden, but something's not good. And because something's not good, God creates animals and he brings the animals for the earthling to name them. And this is a beautiful part of human consciousness. If we look at the story as the development of human consciousness, one of the unique things about your consciousness is the discovery that you can give meaning to your world. And you can name and you can say what it means and what it is. This, you can correlate this with the development of a child. Some of the first things the child learns in language is to name things. That's mama, that's papa, that's ball, that's dog. It's this discovery that my consciousness can give meaning to my world. But even in this development of consciousness, there's something not good. And so it's almost like Yahweh goes back to the drawing board and says, okay, animals doesn't work, well, let's put him back to sleep. And we've kind of translated it, God takes a rib from him. Again, it was Rashi that brings about this beautiful idea that what we've translated the rib can also be translated a side. And so it's also in their drawings and in many of the other myths, you will have a male and a female back to back, but one person. And in these images, God then divides them down the middle, and he takes one side of the earthling so that they can face one another. Isn't that beautiful? That this, and actually the words he uses, he did not find a companion comparable to him. And that word comparable, it's almost like a mirror reflection. It's the same, but it's opposite. One of the translations says he needed a helper that opposed him. Isn't that beautiful? That the very fact that makes this relationship so helpful is that there's both a recognition of likeness, but also a recognition of you're going to help me by the very fact that you're my opposite. And that you oppose me, and that in you I find a reflection. And in that reflection I come to know myself better. And so this is this beautiful exploration, that part of what makes you uniquely human is that you discover who and what you are in relationship with others. It's not something that you are not an entity in isolation. And when you are, it's a situation that's not good. That the whole thing of being human is a thing about relationship. It's a thing about friendship. It's a thing about communion. And so God takes one side, they face one another. And then it makes this statement that they were both naked yet unashamed. So if the question, let's bring back the question, if the question is what makes us human, then these stories has got to do with the development of human consciousness. And there's a stage within human consciousness in which there's no differentiation between self and the other. This is a beautiful picture of how that self begins to develop, that I begin to recognize likeness in one that is not me, that there's separation, there's relationship. But consciousness has not developed to its full extent because they're naked, yet nothing interesting happens. They're unashamed. Like those toddlers we walked into at the beach. You know, they are developing a sense of self, but there's still a real lack of self-consciousness, and that's why there's such blissful, innocent enjoyment. You know, when we saw those toddlers, I couldn't help but think back of our kids when they were that age. And I kind of, for a moment, I wished, I wish they were that age again. You know, I wish they just stayed at that age, stay big and married now. And then I realized how short our memories are, because if I asked any of the parents of those toddlers, would you like them to stay that age forever, they would say no. Please, get to a stage where you can change your own nappy. So, interestingly enough, we often want to go back to this paradise of innocence. And there's a way of doing it. But it's not the naive innocence of like the 2.5, 3-year-old child, because although that's really beautiful, really cute, and we enjoyed our kids, that's at that stage, it's nothing compared to the joy that my son now experiences and my daughter now experiences in finding love in another one who's like themselves, and they had to bridge the gap of individual wills. They had to, as individual selves, come together and willingly join themselves in an intimacy that is at a much greater depth than what that 2.5-year-old experiences. The experience of the 2.5-year-old is beautiful, but it's not the same as the experience of the adult. And so this story continues to explore the development of human consciousness. So we go into chapter 3, and what we have there is suddenly an awareness of cause and effect intercede. That's another thing that makes you uniquely human. You're able to tell a story. You're able to start seeing that there's causes and effects in my life. And if I do certain things happen. And one of the things that we do that no other animal does is we project the story forward. And we all become aware that our stories have one thing in common. They're all going to end in death. And so the awareness of death becomes a much more greater obsession within humans than within animals. Now, I grew up next to the Kruger National Park. You've got a beautiful park here. You'll know that the deer roaming here, they're aware of danger, but they're not obsessing with the fact that one day their lives are going to end. They're just busy looking for food for today, for water, for shelter, and for an opportunity to reproduce. And when that is over, we do it all over again. But there's no obsession with, my life's going to end. That is something that's unique about humans. Maybe not on a conscious level, but on a subconscious level, there's always this awareness of, is this all worth it? Does my life really have purpose? Seeing that it's all going to come to an end. And so in Genesis 3, we have this interesting idea that the consciousness of death is introduced. So maybe there never was a paradise that was deathless. Okay, let me say it this way. Death has always been a part of life. For a plant to exist, bacteria needs to die within the ground. For that plant to grow and for animals to exist, the plant needs to die. For the animals to live, other animals might need to die. In fact, all the life that exists on our planet exists because our sun is dying at the rate of billions of gases, tons of gases that's burned, and that's the heat is coming towards Earth. And so it's the death of our sun that allows life upon this planet. So what does Paul mean that, death ended? Maybe it's what Hebrews 2 speaks about, that Jesus came to set us free from the fear of death. That biological death has always been a reality. But somewhere within human consciousness, the awareness of death became so overwhelming that it became an underlying fear and motivation for what we do with our lives, to preserve ourselves, to hold fast to what we have, to no longer give because I'm obsessed with preserving, because there's this awareness of death coming. So the chapter starts with, don't eat that tree, you will surely die. You can almost feel the anxiety building. Death is mentioned. And then there comes this whispering voice. Has God said, you should not eat? Yes, he said we shouldn't even touch. Now, he never said you shouldn't even touch. It almost betrays the anxiety that has entered human consciousness, that I shouldn't even touch this. And so the whispering voice continues and says, you won't surely die. It's because God doesn't want you to be like him. So, what does that mean? God doesn't want you to be like. What does that imply? It implies that what you are is not enough. And God has a greater being, and he doesn't want you to partake of his being. He wants you to remain inferior. That's what that whispering voice implies. It's God that doesn't want you to be like him. That's why he said you can't eat of this. And we can see this process of the awakening of desire happening in every human development. Somewhere in the child's development, there's a whispering voice that says, you're not enough. You lack being. And when a sense of lack of being enters, what happens? We start grasping after every fruit that promises to give us more being. This is why every advertisement, what they put next to the new car, is the best looking model you've ever seen. Because they know that what the underlying sense of lack that's present in all people is a sense of lack of being. And so it's like the toddler walking into the room, the first thing he notices is the other toddler. And when we look at advertisements, the first thing we notice is the model. And the next thing we notice is the toy closest to the model. And I can't just replace this model, but at least I can have what they have. And so Genesis is starting to deal with the subject of desire. And all of it's not negative. In fact, the most beautiful friendships you have exists because you have similar desires. The friends that you enjoy are friends that enjoy the same kind of stuff that you enjoy. But, you know, the 10-year-old boys that walk around and they enjoy fishing together and they enjoy hunting together, and then they go to high school, and in their teenage years they suddenly notice the same girl. And the very movement that made friendship possible, which is we have similar desires, suddenly becomes a cause of conflict. Because now we both desire the same girl, but there's just one girl like that. Okay, and that can become rivalry. So desire in itself is neither good nor evil. But it's whether it causes rivalry that becomes destructive. And so Genesis continues that, okay, she partakes of the fruit, and Adam partakes with her, and suddenly everything becomes more sensual and sensory. But sensual, maybe have a more sexual connotation to it, which is also valid in this context. But everything is now about how it feels, how it sounds, how it looks, how it tastes. And she looked at the fruit and saw that it is desirable to give one power and wisdom. And they both partake. And in the narrative, suddenly God enters the story in a very sensory way. Before this, we don't know of God walking in the cool of the day, but suddenly they heard the sound of God walking in the cool. It's something you feel of the day. It's almost like the whole narrative have now taken on the perspective of the earthlings who have awoken in their consciousness to a sensory world from which I'm separated. And in child development, there's a stage where this child suddenly becomes aware that these are my limbs, and they can feel, and they can touch, and these are my ears. They can see, this is my mouth, I'm going to try everything. You know, they want to eat everything, try everything, push sticks into every orifice they can find because they're discovering this is my body, and the senses have been awakened. And now they perceive God as walking in the garden, and now guilt and shame enters. All of this is part of what every human being have experienced in growing up. So what I want to suggest tonight, and some might be happy about it, some might not, some might just accept this alternative interpretation as another way of reading it, but I'm bringing it across because it's both a very ancient interpretation, but it's also an interpretation that gives us a lot of insight into what it means to be human. And the suggestion is this, that the authors of these stories weren't trying to tell us history lessons. They are trying to explore what does it mean to be human. How does human consciousness develop? And so in this process, they come to suddenly hide from God. And God says, where are you? And they said, we heard you, we became aware of you, but we were afraid because we were naked. Can you see how consciousness has suddenly taken on a new level? There's a stage with your kids where you can just still walk into the bathroom and they can't care less, and then there's suddenly a stage where you know, I'm naked and I'm aware of it. And that changes within human consciousness. And then it's interesting, what we have always interpreted as the curse, it could simply be read as God's telling them the inevitable consequences of what it means to grow up. So he tells Adam, and you might have to one day tell this to your son, is that
Make them loud.
he tells Adam that, okay, if you want to eat, it's going to mean that you're going to eat by the sweat of your labor. Isn't that the stage that all of us need to realize? Mom and Dad doesn't give us everything for the rest of our lives. There's a stage in which I've got to sweat. I've got to labor for it to come. He tells Eve, you're going to bear children and there might be pain and labor involved. In other words, as in Genesis 2, where they were naked and unashamed, those 2 years old on the beach could run and bump into one another naked, and there was no painful consequences. But if you're older and you run around naked and bumping into people, the consequences is probably that you're going to get pregnant and you're going to bear children. And so everything that we've interpreted as curses can be interpreted as these are the inevitable consequences of growing up. You're going to work, you're going to love, you're going to become pregnant, there's going to, in fact, the real world includes a bit of pain and complexity. And it's not because it's rotten and fallen, it's just the reality of what this world is like. And so in the Jewish mind, even them being expelled from the garden is not a vertical picture, but is more a picture of birth. It's a horizontal picture. God sending them out of the paradise of a naive innocence, of a consciousness that is still, that there's no awareness of difference between self and other, sending them out into the real world. And it's amazing, just after God announces what it means that they've eaten of this. And the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is not a good translation. The better translation would be the tree of good and bad. So it doesn't speak about absolute good and absolute evil. It rather, and again, if you look at how the words are used in other places, it speaks about the ability to do value judgments. That some things are better and some things are worse. Some things are good and some things are bad. This is, again, a stage of human development that everyone needs to go through. But you need to start deciding, what do I want, what don't I want? What is better, what is worse? And that is part of becoming human. You have to be able to make value judgments. Now, like every 5-year-old child looks at their parents and they are grateful because they provide food, they provide shelter, they provide clothing, but they also get frustrated with their parents because these are the guys that says no every now and then. They are both a source, but they're also a limitation. They both enable me, but they also disable me from just doing everything. And so it's natural for kids to feel frustrated, and when dad or mom says no, it's interpreted as punishment. And it might not be punishment. It might just be parents caring for you. That's why I say no, you can't put your hand in the barbecue because it's not good for you. And just listen. So as we see the perspective of the earthling changing, they perceive God as the one who punishes, but actually God is just telling them the reality of what it means to become fully human. And in an amazing twist. Now what's so beautiful, when just after Adam named all the animals, then God takes a side, he awakes and he sees this image of one that is like him, yet opposite to him. It is such an overwhelming experience that he seems to lose his capacity to name. He can't even give her a name at that time. He just says, you will be named. He kind of speaks about another time in which she will be given a name because he can't think of anything now. Many of you might have experienced that in that moment of awakening, of love and desire, that you are descended. Because you discover I'm not in control completely of myself, because there's part of myself outside of myself. And now, only after the pronouncement of what life is like, now Adam turns to his wife and he names her. This is the first time that she's called Eve. Now, up until this stage, it wasn't Eve that had the conversation with the serpent. Or it was the woman. It's this more generic term to show us that this is a story that's relevant to every man and woman. It's only after this, that after the pronouncement of what we call the curse or the consequences of their growing up, that Adam turns to his wife and says, your name will be Eve because you are the mother of all life. Now, logically, she's just the mother of human life. But maybe it's through coming into this experience of a life that's much richer, much more complex, much more depth than what he ever imagined, that he turns to the one who led him into this complexity of desire and relationship, and he says, you are the source of all life, of a new richness of life that wasn't there in that naive innocence. So, what are the consequences of understanding these stories differently? There are many, but I want to maybe just touch on one or two. If this story was never meant to simply tell us that there once was a perfect world, which was messed up, because in believing that, we often then perceive our present situation as not quite perfect. Yes, Jesus came and we think he tried to make it better, but obviously it didn't quite work out just right because it's still pretty messed up out there and complex. So we have a hope that one day we would be restored back to that paradise that was there. So in that consciousness that there was a perfect world and one day there will be a perfect world, where does it leave me now? But in this in-between situation where I kind of tolerate life, I tolerate my existence, and I hope we move in the right direction. But if this story is about what does it mean to be human, how does human consciousness come into existence, how does God lead us through a conversation, and no matter how we misunderstand him, he continues to be with us, to provide for us, to give us clothing. You know, they sew together their fig leaves, try and make most of this new thing. God says, hey, I'll help you out. I'll continue to provide. Doesn't look like a God that's totally pissed off at them. He's the one who's searching for them. He's the one who wants to help them further. If that is what the story is about, then maybe we can come into an awareness that this life, right here, right now, is what God intended for you. But he's not trying to restore you back to some lost perfection. Neither is he trying to deliver you out of this rotten world and take you to some heavenly perfection. But rather it's right here in the midst of all the complexity and contradiction that we face, that Jesus, who is this message that God inhabits human flesh, that God incarnates himself, becomes this wonderful hope that right here, right now, your body is the temple. And that's just another way of saying the garden. The garden and the temple was the same idea in the Old Testament. The temple wasn't a place people went to worship on a weekly basis. The temple was God's resting place. This is where God dwelt, where he was at home. The same with the garden. And so when Paul says, don't you know that your bodies is the temple of God's Spirit? That it is in your life that God is at home. But he's not trying to just take you back to a lost perfection or draw you forward to a future promise. But he's trying to open your eyes to the beauty of what is right in front of you. To the wonder of who you are right now, right here. And desire, I began with it, so I want to complete with it. Desire takes on a different form because in that awareness that God is at home in my life, desire is no longer awakened out of a sense of lack, out of this misunderstanding that God is trying to withhold from me. But it is out of this understanding that God has emptied himself into me, that he doesn't withhold his image and likeness, but he gives himself to me, that my desires are now awakened out of a sense of fullness. That my desires are motivated by this underlying desire to give what has been given to me. To allow this stream that's constantly pouring into me to continue to flow and pour out and bring life to others. So that is such an important distinction. That's why in John 15 verse 7, Jesus says that if you abide in me, my words abide in you. We've translated it, then you can ask for whatever you want and it will be done for you. The Greek has got such a specific sequence, which is very insightful. The Greek says, you will desire, you will ask, and it will be created. In other words, being in this place of fellowship and intimacy with God is what now awakens desire. We don't have to remain in our infancy, where wrong interpretations and suggestions of lack continues to be the motivation that makes us want to protect ourselves and guard ourselves. We enter into the fullness of what Jesus reveals, and that is your life is where God gives himself fully to you. And it is out of this sense of fullness that desires are now awakened to bless others. Woo! Glory. Do you want to, shall we do a song or two first, or do you want to just jump away with the questions now? If you have questions now, we can just go for it. Otherwise, we'll do a song or two while you think of the questions. But yeah, maybe any questions, any ideas, any comments? Is that a bit of a different way of reading Genesis 2 and 3?
Refreshing.
Oh, good, good.